Now moving on, let's meet someone from Canada who isn't low-life scum. Climate systems scientist Paul Beckwith. A while back, we sat down with Paul to discuss not just climate change, but what we can realistically do about it. With recent developments such as this one, it's just no longer enough to simply recycle and bike to work. We need to get real about what we're up against and what we can do realistically to mitigate the worst of what we have wrought. For more on the rising tides, the melting ice, and the road ahead, Paul Beckwith. Take a look.
Most of the change is in the Arctic. The Arctic is a very sensitive area as far as climate change is concerned, because there's a lot of sea ice up there covering the Arctic Ocean. There's also a lot of snow cover on both the ice and the land surrounding the Arctic Ocean. And what we're seeing is an exponential drop in the sea ice coverage of the Arctic Ocean, and also in the snow cover, mostly in the spring, up in the Arctic region. So what this means is that the whole region is darker than it used to be. So during the Arctic summers, the region is darker, so it's absorbing more solar radiation from the sun, so it's heating up faster and faster. So it's a feedback effect, a reinforcing feedback effect. As we lose ice, as we lose snow, there's more exposed dark areas, either the open ocean or the permafrost underneath, and that absorbs more sunlight, heats up, melts even more ice. So we get into this cycle, and as a result, the Arctic temperatures are much warmer than the rate of warming in the Arctic exceeds that of anywhere else on the planet. In fact, it's the number that you hear a lot is 2 times, but it's actually a lot worse than that. The high Arctic is more like 5 to 8 times. The rate of warming is 5 to 8 times faster than the rest of the planet, especially the equator. The equator doesn't change too much because when there's more heat at the equator, you get more evaporation of water, but the actual temperature isn't rising too much. It is rising, but nowhere near as much. So why this is important to the planet is because the jet streams, which guide our weather patterns, basically act as a wall between cold, dry air in the Arctic from warm, humid air further south, are divided by the jet stream, and the jet stream is determined by that temperature difference between the equator and the Arctic. So as the Arctic temperatures are warming by huge amounts, the temperature difference to the equator decreases, the jet streams therefore slow down and become wavier. And this is why we're seeing extreme weather events skyrocketing around the planet. They're happening more often, they're more severe, and also they last longer, and they're also occurring in places where we never had them before. So as we continue to lose sea ice and snow cover and have a greatly warmer Arctic, as those things accelerate, the extreme weather events around the planet will accelerate, and that affects infrastructure, it affects global food supply, it affects everybody on the planet essentially.
So with that, because the majority of our planet is water, talk about the acidification of the oceans, because that's also something that you deal with. What's happening, and again, what does that mean for us who live on the land?
Yes, so we basically, our greenhouse gas emissions from combustion of fossil fuels, also from changing land use, like cutting down forests, replacing them with farmland, we're we're reducing the sinks on the planet for CO2, and we're increasing the sources. So the net result is the CO2 levels are going much higher in the atmosphere, as well as other greenhouse gases. So we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. Whenever it rains, some of that CO2 in the atmosphere gets dissolved in the rainwater, forming carbonic acid, which then falls into the oceans. So over the ocean pH, which is a measure of acidity, has been pretty constant without much variance over 40 million years. And what we've done is we've dropped it from 8.2 roughly to 8.05. Because it's a logarithmic scale, that means an increase of about 30% in ocean acidity. And when that number gets down to 7.8, 7.9, then marine creatures will not be able to form calcium carbonate backbones, which many of them rely on. So we're basically harming the food chain. We're getting very precariously numbers in pH in the oceans. And when we start harming, it's already happening. We're starting to harm the entire marine food chain, and life cannot exist on the land if there's no life in the oceans. The opposite could happen. We could lose all life on land and the oceans would do just fine. But if we lost the majority of life in the oceans, then we wouldn't have support for life on land either.
So I'll get to the solutions in a second, but for right now, is there like a pause button or a slow down button? What are we definitely going to have to face head on, and what might we be able to mitigate or even possibly avoid altogether?
Well, the climate system is a lot more sensitive than many people have recognized. People tend to think of things changing in a linear fashion, and this is a highly nonlinear system that we're talking about. So things can, for example, temperatures can increase slowly and then they spike upwards to another state. And this seems to be what is happening in the Arctic. We're transitioning from an Arctic that we were used to an Arctic with no sea ice cover on the ocean, no snow cover on the land, and we're heading there in a very rapid time frame, less than a decade even. And this can lead to abrupt rises in temperature. The Earth is quite capable of increasing average temperature, say 5 degrees in a decade or two. So so I think we need to recognize first of all, the public and politicians, everybody, decision makers need to recognize that this is an emergency situation with the climate. We're on the cusp of having these huge irreversible changes. We're already transitioning through this abrupt change, and we have to treat it as an emergency. And what we would need to do is we need to slash fossil fuel emissions. We need to deploy technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, so lower CO2 levels, which would lower ocean acidification levels. And we also need to look at deploy things to cool the Arctic, because if we go from an Arctic, snow-covered, ice-covered Arctic to an Arctic with completely no ice on the ocean year-round or snow up on cover year-round, then the carbon that is stored in the permafrost, both on land and in the seafloor, will start coming up in large quantities, strengthening the warming. Also, we will lose ice very rapidly from Greenland, and sea level rise will spike upwards as well. And then once they spike upwards from Greenland, then they will cause problems to ice caps also on Antarctica. So this winter, the ice is not forming properly in the Arctic. There's actually days where we lose ice. There's lots of export of thick ice out through the Fram Strait between Greenland and Svalbard. As the ice tries to regrow, it pushes out into warmer water and it gets melted off very quickly. Storms in the Arctic create lots of wave action, which mixes up the water at the surface, which is close to freezing, to warmer water below, and that's impeding the growth of ice this year. So we're out of known territory this year with the present freeze of the ice. So what this does is precondition the ice to melt that much faster in the next melt season as we head into summer of 2017.
So talking about shifting towards these solutions, you mentioned just now the fossil fuel emissions. Do you think something like a carbon tax is too little, too late? And I'm also curious what your thoughts are on the UN report that livestock is responsible for 18% of the greenhouse gases that cause global warming, more than cars, planes, and all other forms of transport put together.
Yes, a carbon tax is absolutely necessary for all countries of the world. We need to have a price on carbon because that's economically, it's the simplest way to put a price on carbon to reduce carbon going up into the atmosphere ocean system. and we can ramp up the prices of carbon as quickly as we need to cut fossil fuel emissions. And but there's no, we have enormous subsidies on fossil fuels at the moment, and that's like a negative carbon tax of about, it's almost, in some countries it's about $40 a ton of carbon. So we're giving fossil fuel companies $40, for each ton of carbon that they put up in the atmosphere. So what's the point of putting a carbon tax on when you have that subsidy? We have to kill the subsidy and put the carbon tax on, and we can return the money gathered from the carbon tax with the carbon fee and dividend, which I'm a real advocate of, and this is what Citizens Climate Lobby and James Hansen has been pushing for quite a while. You have a dividend going back to the public, so 3/4 of the public gets actually extra money. They get more money back than they pay in fossil fuels. It's heavy fossil fuel users that end up paying more. So that's leg one of my so-called three-legged bar stool or three-pronged approach. That's necessary to slash fossil fuel emissions. Also, meat is livestock is a very large producer of carbon. So one of the it's easy, rather than get rid of it completely, if we price in a proper carbon tax or carbon price fee, then meat prices will go up significantly, and people will cut back on their meat consumption. The market will determine how quickly that happens. So the most important thing is a carbon price, a carbon fee.
So one of the other prongs that you talk about, going back to the solutions, is solar radiation management, and hacking the climate, basically. And Riley Duran, a systems engineer at NASA, said that geoengineering, of which SRM is a part, isn't a cure. At best, it's a band-aid, and at worst, it could be a self-inflicted wound. Talk about that, and talk about using solar radiation management as a tool.
Yes. It would be ideal if it was sufficient for us to slash fossil fuel emissions and address climate change. But we've set into motion changes in a system that are going to continue even when we slash fossil fuel emissions. So slashing fossil fuel emissions is necessary, but not sufficient. So the next phase, the next idea I should mention is the carbon dioxide removal, because even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the last report that came out in a few years ago, assumes for the RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 2.6 scenario, which is the best case scenario, it assumes that at some point we remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And they push a technology they call BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. But that's only one idea. That's only one way to lower, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is a vital part. This is the only thing that will stop the oceans turning more acidic. This is the only thing that will start bringing the levels in the atmosphere down so that their heat trapping properties are similar to are conducive to a stable climate. But this is not sufficient because the Arctic is warming so quickly. If we lose the sea ice and snow cover in the Arctic, then everything we've seen to do with climate change now will be quickly forgotten, because things will get much, much worse by orders of magnitude in terms of storms and in terms of threat to global food supply, et cetera. We're going to have global food shortages. So what we have to do is try to cool the Arctic, to bring it back down, to restore the stability, some stability in the jet streams, to buy time. And the only way I can see of doing that is to employ some solar radiation management technologies, whether they be, the quickest thing would be to have some sulfur dioxide in the upper atmosphere to cool the planet. I call it the anthropogenic Arctic volcano, because it's a large volcano, puts lots of sulfur dioxide in the upper atmosphere, cools the planet. So Pinatubo in 91, when it went off, it caused the global average temperatures to drop by 0.5 to 0.7 degrees Celsius for 3 years. And it was because of all the sulfur dioxide that was injected from the volcano into the stratosphere. And once it's in the stratosphere, it's above weather, so it's not rained out. Gravity pulls it down. It takes 2 or 3 years. So we could, the cheapest, quickest, most inexpensive way that will be fast acting to cool the Arctic would be to use, sulfur dioxide is only one possible material. There's lots of other ideas using, say, calcium carbonate and other things. But we're talking about concentrations for sulfur dioxide even that are much lower than what we're putting into the lower atmosphere by coal burning power plants.
And that method wouldn't be dangerous or even accessible to, for example, humans or plants or animals or anything like that?
Well, see, the thing is in order to answer that question, we need to compare the risk to society of doing nothing to the risk to society of doing this. What I'm saying is the risk to society of doing nothing is enormous. We're going to lose the ability to feed the world, the people around the world. We're going to get temperatures rising in some farmland areas, so crops fail. We're going to get floods in other farmland areas, so crops fail. We're going to have suddenly a massive food shortage. This is almost guaranteed if we continue to let climate change accelerate. So this is an enormous risk to humanity. So the risk of creating an artificial volcano is well known. I mean, we have these things going off naturally. I would say that the risks of we could always stop deploying the technology, right? If it doesn't work, we just stop doing it, and it would affect the climate for a couple of years, and then that's it. It would go away because that's what happens when there's a large volcano. So we can start off small and start doing it small and ramping it up depending on how things work. And we know how it will work because whenever a large volcano goes off, we see these effects all of the time. Our path forward is absolutely necessary. We're in a climate change emergency. This is what we need to do to ensure that to stabilize the climate system. And also, what we're seeing in the public is we're seeing people go from, climate change isn't a problem, don't worry about it, to we're completely screwed. We can't do anything, right? We're finished, right? Just enjoy life, and we're all going to die in 10 years or 20 years or pick your number, right? I don't buy either of those proposals. They're extreme views, black and white thinking. Either we're all completely fine or we're all going to die. Humans are going to go extinct. I mean, that's just ludicrous, ridiculous, polarized, black and white thinking to me.
To learn more about Paul's work and to see his own videos about a variety of climate science issues, visit paulbeckwith.net. And speaking of climate, you may have heard about the upcoming climate march here in DC on April 29th. Now, as much as I'm a fan of people showing up in DC to march and party, I urge you to stay in your own community and work on your local climate issues. Use this National Day of Action on the 29th to sow seeds of both resistance and, more importantly, alternatives. Building in our own towns, in our streets, that is what will make a difference. Find a local pipeline fight, a dirty energy project that's just waiting for the people to shut it down. Look in your own backyards.